Hi, so we're going to continue our study of Aristotle, and we're going to turn now from the work on the soul, which we were looking at for the last two lectures, to the Nicomachean ethics. And our focus is going to be on the nature of the human being, on human nature. We've already begun to look at human nature and on the soul, in as much as Aristotle in that work did talk about thinking. And thinking is a capacity exhibited by human beings in a way that doesn't seem to be true of any other being in the natural world. And so that already got us into talking about the distinctive character of the human being. But that work on the soul wasn't a study of human nature, it was a study of the soul. And if you read that work, more than anything, Aristotle seems interested in sensation. He's got so many chapters on it. And it's very detailed with respect to that, whereas the stuff on thinking kind of flies by pretty quickly. So we're going to hold on to that insight that we took from On the Soul, but now we're going to turn to this work, the Nicomachean Ethics, where what it is to be a human being really seems to be the defining question. So we're going to start in the first book of the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle basically asks that defining question: what is a human being? What's the definitive characteristic of a human being? And then we're going to go on. We're just going to begin this. We're going to introduce ourselves to the study that takes up the rest of the book, which is, what does it take for there to be a fulfilled human life? And we're really only going to scratch the surface of that, but nonetheless, the things we'll look at are, I think, very powerful. The first thing we're going to do is look at basically the definition of the human being in Book 1, Chapter 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Before looking directly at the text, though, I want you just to think about the human being. What is a human being? And to begin thinking about that, I want you to remember that, in philosophy class, when somebody asks you that, you may go back and say, "Oh, I don't know about that question," But in your everyday life, you recognize human beings all the time. So I want you to go back to your everyday recognition. Like, just notice what it's like for you to walk down the street. Like, you recognize people and dogs and cats and birds, different types of plants, different types of trees, and so on. In your everyday life, you are constantly recognizing these different types of being, including the human being. So we are going to talk, our focus is going to be on what's going on in the human being. But before we talk about that directly, I would just like to underline this fact that you recognize those other things. And I'd like you to think about that for a second, about what goes on there. So I said before that Aristotle in many ways resembles something closer to what you might think of as a biologist than a physicist in the modern sense. I mean, Aristotle, in fact, studied everything, and he's one of the most learned individuals that human history has recorded. He's an amazing person. But though he studied everything, there is a basic way that his basic sensibility towards the world comes very close to what I would call an observational biologist, right? He is a person who is attuned in his study to the different forms of life. That's the biologist part. And his method is basically observation. By observation, I don't mean casually looking around to see things. I mean, disciplined, study of something where you look at it, you get to know it in its different contexts, you reflect on it, you try to organize your thoughts. Pretty rigorous work. But it's rigorous not by conducting experiments exactly, where you design an experiment to see how you can make this thing react to some conditions you set up, but by trying to put yourself in a position of seeing how this thing functions naturally. And I'd like to think about your own everyday experiences of being effectively an observational biologist. Now, you don't, presumably, most of us have not taken that on as a career, but if you have a pet dog or a pet cat, you probably know that animal reasonably well, right? And by spending time with it, probably over some years, you've got to know its rhythms, its needs, its likes, its dislikes, its interests. And I mean, again, think of a little child. A little child growing up, mom and dad bring home a puppy, and the little kid's like, "Oh, that's pretty cool." The kid doesn't really know what a dog is, but the child will learn what a dog is through spending time with that puppy. And as the puppy grows up, the dog will get to know more and more like what a dog is like. And the point is, you with your dog or cat, like you know what a dog is, you know what a cat is, and you know that, as you know, probably especially if you've lived with one. But even if you didn't live with one, most of us have a decent idea about dogs and cats just from encountering them, all around. So the thing I want you to just notice there, from the point of view of everyday experience, is that the things don't have a secret essence. You know what a dog is because dog really means a form of life, right? A tulip puts its form of life on display, or an orange puts its form of life on display by going through that process of growing into a tree, producing these orange orbs, dropping them off, etc., right? And similarly, a dog puts its essence, its form of life on display. Its essence isn't a secret thing. Its essence is what it is. And what it is a way of living, a form of living. And so things in the natural world simply are the displaying of their essence to, anybody who wants to observe them. And if you take the time to observe things in the natural world, you will learn what that form of life is. And I really want to keep underlining that expression, form of life, because I think, put that way, the point I'm making is pretty straightforward and pretty clear. Whereas when someone says, well, you have to learn the form of that thing, that can immediately make it seem like some kind of mysterious thing you're looking for somewhere that's hidden inside it or something like that. There's nothing like that in Aristotle or Plato, for that matter. The point is, we're talking about a characteristic mode of behaving, a characteristic mode of acting, a characteristic mode of living, right? And you recognize that by watching it and seeing how that mode of living gets carried out. And it takes time. You got to be in the right place. You got to have enough time. But my point is just that in the natural world, the forms of things are manifest. That's the only thing that's manifest. That's what nature is. It is forms of life carrying themselves out, and in that sense manifesting themselves in the natural world. And provided you can put yourself in an appropriate position to observe them, you can become familiar with them. With the dog and the cat, becoming familiar with that form of life is recognizing the familiar behavior. But notice that recognition also means a basic level of understanding. Like, you come to know why the cat is doing this at this time. Like, it's because it's hungry. Or you know why it's performing this action. Oh, because it's hunting that mouse. It's getting ready to pounce. In other words, the observation of the behavior, the very notion of observation brings with it that sense of intelligence, right? And so our apprehension of the what of the thing is our understandingly grasping the sense of those manifest behaviors that we see displayed all the time. And you might think, why can we grasp the sense? Well, because those behaviors make sense, right? The animal is doing that because it's got to get that mouse to eat, right? And so the animal's actions will basically show you why they're doing what they're doing, because they are governed by a goal and governed by a norm. And so the whole meaning of the action is putting on display its why, right? And so that observation of the dog or the cat, whereby you gradually come to grasp a basic form of life, is an understanding grasp, right? Which takes us back to the issue we were talking about last time about the difference between perception in a simple sense and knowing, right? And with respect to a form of life, grasping that why is then grasping something about what that thing striving for and what it takes, what it needs to do well or to do poorly. So the thing I want you to the notion I want you to sort of have going on here is that in observing nature, seeing what you see, what you understand, the and the sort of factual and the norm governed, like these are not radically different things. They're all wrapped up, right? Your observation is grasping the norm governed reality that reveals itself in the perceptual forms of animal behavior, plant behavior, stellar behavior. Anyway, so as I said, if you think about your own familiar experience, you can recognize that even though you probably didn't sit down like Aristotle and really put work into doing this well, even without the trying, you have a pretty good idea what makes a dog happy and what makes a cat happy, what a cat needs, what a dog needs. Right? The basic form of life of those things is something you become familiar with. And even if you never tried to formulate it to yourself in words, at a sort of practical level, you have a pretty good sense of what you have to do to help or hinder the cat or the dog and it's making its way. So that's the first point, and that's actually a pretty important point, right? That's a point about knowing nature. And again, I was saying in an earlier lecture, I was trying to distinguish Aristotle's approach to nature from a Newtonian approach to nature, and I think right there you can see a lot, right? That this kind of way of observing nature to learn the meaningful forms in which it presents itself is quite different from the experimental dissection of it, so to speak, for the purpose of grasping the elementary forms of motion and so on that can be harnessed for essentially for technological means, right? But you can really think about the different sense of what it is that you're doing in Aristotelian or Newtonian physics. What is it that you're trying to understand, and what do you understand? What do you interpret that reality you're encountering to be? But that's a side thing for you to think about. But mostly, I just wanted to bring out this basic point about the observation of nature, which, as I say, is a pretty important point in its own right. But the reason I'm bringing it out here is because I want you to think, okay, I can do that with a dog and a cat, and I want you to notice, hey, you do that with people too, right? So if someone says, what's human nature? Like, it's kind of a, I don't know, high schoolish kind of thing to say, oh, that's very mysterious. What is human nature? What's the essence of human nature? And you can act like that's philosophy. The point is, it's not very hard to understand human nature. Like, you look around you, and it's on display all the time. You ask yourself these questions because it's a form of life, right? You can ask yourself these questions: what do people do? What do they need? What do they want? And I think the answers are pretty clear. Pretty basic things like, what do people do? Well, on the one hand, of course, they do the same thing as plants and animals. They eat. So yeah, they eat, they sleep, they reproduce. Those are human things for sure. You wouldn't have human beings if those things weren't going on. That's right. And like the dog and the cat and the horse, they perceive and take pleasure in their perceptions and in their hearing. It's nice to hear sounds. It's nice to see things. I like to walk down the street, look at the flowers and all that sort of stuff, feel the air. It's great. Just like a dog would, and like dogs and cats and lions, like we have families and so on. An emotional life like dogs and cats, we move like dogs and cats. We get hungry like dogs and cats, right? So all those things, you can say all those things about people and they're true. But why don't we take a step beyond that and say, okay, yeah, but what are the distinctive things human beings do? Well, you can think of some things at a very broad level. We have governments, like humanity, not just you, but humanity. We have governments, we have religions, we have an artistic heritage, we have science. Like, those are big things that humanity as such does, right? That humans do that, whether or not you do. Think at an individual level. Like, we talk, we like to learn things. People as a rule want to go to school and learn. Any given individual might not, but by and large, people want to understand things. We have values. And we have courts of law, and so both at an individual level and at a societal level, like, we're concerned about fair treatment. You care if you are wronged, and I hope you care if you've wronged someone else. And you go to court because society cares about those things, and we want to work those things out together. This list could go on. Actually, let me go on with a couple other things. Like, we want companionship. We want, intimate, romantic, and sexual relationships. We want friends. We want a fulfilling job. So I'm not going to go on and add more to that. And I don't take what I've said to be particularly systematic or rigorous, though it's admittedly thoughtful, by which I mean, this isn't the first time this question has come to my mind. And, I put some effort into thinking about it. And so the things I listed to you were still intelligently selected, even if done sort of spontaneously. But anyway, but nonetheless, my point is, I'm just pulling out stuff that I think anybody could pull out. And in defense of that claim, this is a question I've asked classrooms of people that I've taught. I've asked this question, I don't know, 100 times. I don't know how many classes on Aristotle I've taught, but the answers are always the same. Every year I teach this class, I ask a different group of people. Some of the particular words are different. Sometimes one thing comes out here and it didn't come out there. But basically, that thing I just said is the answer that every single class I have ever asked this question to has come up with. So my point is, we have a pretty good idea what people are. In the same way we know what dogs and cats are. We've observed them. And saying what we are is amounted to here, saying, what our form of life is. Like, what are the things we do? We are the kind of being who does these things. To understand that form of life is to take a step beyond that description, because that description was a bit of a list. And to understand it, we'd want to say, okay, how are those things on the list reflective of a nature, of a single form of life? And I'm going to address that in a minute. But the point I want to make is, before saying that, is that this description, I think, should be something that pretty much anyone can recognize as a pretty straightforward account of what people are, or how people behave. And in naming those things that we do, we've also named what we want. We've talked about the things that would make us happy, the things that are fulfilling to us, right? Just as with the dog and cat. Okay, so let's now try to make that other step and say, okay, taking this stuff, can we say what the single thing is that's reflected in all of that? And Aristotle does. He puts a particular word on it, and he says it's a matter of what you're seeing in the human being is the life of logos. That's his word, a Greek word, logos. And logos is a bit of a tricky word. There's no automatic way to translate it in English. That doesn't mean it's hard to understand. If you read Greek, you know what it means. But to turn around and read that sentence and say the human being is living the life of logos, and say, okay, what's that in English? Right? It's a little tricky to pin it down with the word. Historically, that word has been translated in two main ways, both of which I think are really misleading. So I'll tell you what they are in a minute. But before talking about those standard translations that I think are misleading, I want to tell you what I think it means. So logos is a word that, as I said, can mean all kinds of different things. It can mean a ratio between two numbers, a logos, like a proportion. A logos could mean a story, telling a story, giving a logos. It can mean an argument. It can mean the power to think, the power to figure things out. It can mean lots of different things. In English, the word that I think of that comes closest to reflecting that same range of meanings is the word account. Because you can have a mathematical account, you can give an account in the sense of tell a story. You can take account of things in the sense of sort of figure them out. You can be accountable in the sense of answerable to a norm or a value. So if you think about the English word account and how many different things can be said by that word, you're going to get a list, or, a map of meanings that's not identical to, but that overlaps an awful lot with the map of meanings of the word logos. And the types of different meanings are very similar. So if I were going to translate someone who has logos, I would translate it as something like the person who can take account or who can give account, something like that. So So Aristotle, when he tries to talk about the human being, says, I'll just use my translation. It's the one who takes account of things. And if you think about that English expression, take account of things, or gives an account of things, something like that, and and take it back to that list of things that I was describing as kind of the characteristics of the human way of living, I think you'll see it fits in there pretty well. We're economic beings. We have, I don't think I listed that. I think I might have said you have to have a job, but I think I said you want to have a fulfilling job. So probably I should have also said something like, we find, human beings also have to work because we got to make money, and we got to interact with other people who aren't going to give us the products of their labor if we don't pay for them, and so on. So notice that in that way we're always calculating. We got to like put in some hours of work to get a certain amount of money, to have the right amount of money to buy this thing. That notion of calculation, like, that's taking account. And you'll have an account. You'll have a bank account that will take account of what you're worth, right? Your worth in dollars and cents. So that part of human life is a matter of accounting. If you took away that notion of accounting, you wouldn't have economic life. I did mention something like we try to understand things, like we have the sciences. Well, that's taking account of the world, right? Trying to figure it out, trying to figure out how it works. I talked about going to court, like you have to give an account of your actions, and you're held accountable to the law. I talked about art. Well, we tell stories, we write stories, right? Which is giving an account of things, whether in painting or in words. We're storytelling beings. I said we like to talk, like we like to give people an account of our day, exchange words with each other. I mentioned religion. Right? We think about those highest things that we're accountable to. Right? So again, I'm not going to go through the whole list again, but if you go back to the things I was saying that I was trying to pull out that sort of reflect the range of things that are human activities, or if you try to do a reasonable job of coming up with a list on your own, I think if Aristotle's right, and I think he is right, I think if you look at those things, you will see in all those activities, there is a thing happening there. Like, you are looking at a kind of activity that is the activity of an accounting being. So Aristotle talks, I can't remember if he uses the word animal here, I don't think he does, but in another place where he talks about this same issue, in the Politics, Book 1, Chapter 2, he refers to the animal having logos. And that's basically how he describes the human being. And here he says, we're going to look at human life. He says, is that the same as life of a plant? No. Is it the same as the life of animals? No. He says, there remains then an active life of the one having logos. So the tu logon ekontos. He doesn't say animal, but the one having logos. And so there, basically, Aristotle, it seems to me, is defining the human being as the animal that takes account, or that gives account of things. In saying that, he's kind of taken, as I just did, he's taken that whole range of activities and said, what are we seeing here? Right? We're seeing the activities of something that has logos. Our life is basically a kind of animal life, in the sense that we rely on sensation, motion, desire, and all that sort of stuff. But we're that part of the natural kingdom, but we have logos. We have that ability to take account, to hold ourselves accountable, to give an account of ourselves. So that's my quick attempt to bring you into what I would call Aristotle's definition of human nature. And I tried to do it in a way that reflects that kind of observational method, right? To take you through what you would recognize, and then to do the process of trying to grasp the unity of that, and to see, in fact, that there is really a kind of a principle here. And it's that business of taking account. Now, in referring to us as the animal having logos, he's not picking out one of the psychic powers he identified on the soul. There we talked about perception or sensation, aesthesis, and we talked about mind, nous or noesis. But what's logos? Well, if you remember what I talked about when I talked about thinking, and I talked about the way that it's not true on Aristotle's account to say that we are minds, but rather more that we have access to mind. We are people who can take the the very concrete world of nature that we're experientially involved in, and hold it answerable to, or hold it up to the light of, so to speak, thought that we don't generate, but that we can, in a certain sense, channel or harness or receive. So now I want to say just one thing to connect that with Book 1, Chapter 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics to get us into that story, and then we will move on to start pulling something out of that point. So Book 1, Chapter 7, he's basically asking, what does it mean for us to be happy? So he says, how are we going to figure out what human happiness is? And I'm going to just read you from our translation rather than from the Greek. He says, well, to say that happiness is the chief good might just seem like a kind of empty expression. Like you say, yeah, of course everybody wants to be happy. What does that mean? So we need a clearer account. And he says, this might perhaps be given if we could first ascertain the ergon of man. The translation here says function, and that's correct but misleading. Because when we use the word function, we use it in two different ways. Sometimes when we say function, we mean the purpose it serves. You can say, what's the function of man? You would mean, what purpose is man supposed to serve? And that's not what it means. He's saying function just in the sense of characteristic activity. So the word ergon means more like the work. What is the distinctive work or the distinctive activity, the distinctive practice of the human being? So that's what he's asking. And he says, and then if we want to know what's going to make us happy or what would be good for that person, well, we would say what would be good would be defined by that function being allowed to fulfill itself, right? So he says, for just as for a flute player or a sculptor, et cetera, for anything that is defined by a certain function or activity, the good is thought to reside in the function. So that would be true for a human being if the human being has a characteristic and defining action. And then he says, what can this be? Well, he says, well, life seems to be common to plants. We know that already. But what we are seeking is peculiar to the human being. So let's exclude the life of nutrition and growth. We may well need that, but that by itself isn't going to satisfy a human being. You might remember Socrates there when he said the issue for a human being is not whether you live or die, but whether you live or die well, what you take a stand on. Right? So remember that here. But anyway, so he says, well, let's exclude the life of nutrition and growth as the definition of human happiness. But then he says, well, next there would be a life of perception, but that seems to be common to the horse, the ox, and every animal. Exactly, we know that already. We know that because we studied on the soul. Right, so yes, the life of perception, there's a lot of value in that too, and the things related to that, motion and desire and so on. But that's not what's distinctive of the human being. So this is where he says that remark I already read. There remains then, here's the translation here, an active life of the element that has a rational principle. I'm going to come back and say something about a rational principle in a second, but just let me wrap up the point I was making. So he says what we've basically done is we've defined essentially what the distinctive character of human life is. So if we're going to understand, if we want to know what makes a person happy, we can figure that out by understanding the needs of a being defined by logos. And that's what we're going to go on to do. So that's what we're about to study. Before doing that, I just want to make this one mark about the translation. I said I was translating logos as taking account or something like that. Typically, it has been translated as either reason or speech. And I think those are both really, really, really unhelpful translations. Both are correct in a certain sense. You can mean speech by logos, and you can mean reason by logos. Even though those other translations are correct, I find them really unsatisfactory because they are so narrow in the sense of what they bring out of that word. Because the thing that really needs to be brought out of it is precisely that sense in which it contains all these different activities and processes that are reflective of that core meaning, which, as I say, I think is best captured in English by the notion of taking account. Reasoning, using your reason, like in logic and math, is certainly one aspect of that. But to define the human being as a rational animal is a really different thing than to define the human being as an animal that can take account. That second definition is Aristotle's, because animal having logos, an animal that can take account. But Aristotle has commonly been translated as saying the human being is a rational animal. And that, it seems to me, says something very different and has produced incredible misrepresentations and misunderstandings. So I want to say to you, don't find yourself saying that, because if you say that and you think on the basis of that, you're almost certainly going to misunderstand the things you read and misrepresent it. And the same would be true, someone says a speaking animal. Well, yeah, we speak too, but that also falls pretty short of what the range of engagements are that are captured in that notion of taking account. Anyway, so that's just a quick remark about two translations you will see commonly and that you will hear that I think are quite profoundly misleading. So I would encourage you to stick with, you should stick with the Greek, the animal having logos, but if you don't read Greek, I would say stick with the notion of the animal that can take account. Okay, so now let's go on, and from that basic idea, let's talk about fulfilling that life. Okay, so I just want to continue then with this idea of the active life of the one having logos. He says, of this, one part has such a principle in the sense of being obedient to one, the other in the sense of possessing one and exercising thought. So what he's saying there is, you, as a human being, there's a part of you that can reflect a life of logos by virtue of that part of you being obedient to logos. There's another part of you that can reflect a life of logos by actually exercising logos. So what does that mean? Well, part of you, let's take the second one first. You have that capacity to take account of things. So part of what is fulfilling to you as a human being, what is fulfilling to a human being, is the practice of taking account. And so that, that reflects things I already said. It's the other point he makes that's actually particularly striking. Another way in which you, as a being with logos, find fulfillment is in having those aspects of your life that are not themselves a matter of taking account. Having those parts of yourself or those parts of your life be accountable. Having those parts of your life be guided by your power to take account. So that distinction he makes here is one that he then takes up more fully in Book 1, Chapter 13. And there he talks about, the human soul, which is what we're talking about, the distinctive, the first actuality of a natural organized body that is ours, the human body, right? And he's talking about the distinctive characteristics. And he says, the way people commonly talk about us, they make a distinction. They say one element of the soul is irrational. Again, there's that word rational used to translate logos. It's not wrong, but it's not perfect. This one part is irrational and the other has a rational principle. He says, sometimes they separate them into different parts of body. They do this and that. But he says, there's something right about that, regardless of all those distinctions. You are not purely the process of going around taking account of things. That's part of your life, to be sure, but there's lots of other stuff that goes on too. Like, you like to have a nice tasting drink, or you like to get drunk. You like to feel that, or you like a nice massage. Or there are various kinds of bodily pleasure you like to feel. You also like to feel safe, or maybe you like to take risks. Those are aspects of your life too that aren't, in a straightforward sense, just taking account. But then he says, let's focus on that part that is not logos as such. And he says, of the, again, irrational element, of the non-logos element, one division seems to be widely distributed and vegetative. And I mean by that nutrition and growth. Yeah, like your life goes through, you deal with this thing of digestion and growing and all the rest of that, and that's all that stuff. The plant part of your reality, that's not figuring stuff out. But then he says, but there's also another irrational part. But he says one that shares a rational principle. Again, there's the word reason. Like every time that comes up, remember, no, there's a non-logos part that shares logos. Keep that in mind, right? But then he talks about this, and basically what he's talking about here is broadly that issue of appetite, broadly the issue of the things you want and don't want, pleasure and pain, fear, stuff like that. But that but now think about those two. The one that's vegetative, you can't persuade that. You can't persuade your body to deal with digestion differently. You can make choices about it in terms of whether you feed yourself or not. You can starve yourself if you want. But digestion, which is a functioning part of you, like it is in an animal and like it is in a plant, that all that stuff that's part of the psychic functioning that Aristotle called self-nutrition and growth, that is not open to shaping by your taking account. You can handle it better or worse, but it runs effectively autonomously. But the appetitive part, which is shared with the whole animal kingdom, or I guess I shouldn't say shared with, but it's the principle of the animal kingdom that is also part of you. That is, as he says, persuadable by logos. So in other words, you can shape your desires and your feelings about things. So fear isn't something that functions in a person, pleasure isn't something that functions in a person the same way digestion does. Fear and pleasure are still matters that are not logos as such, but how you live out and experience fear and pleasure is something that can change for you as a person in the way that the process of digestion is not gonna. So remember, we said we were looking for what it would take to have a fulfilled human life, and that would be fulfilling the demands of a life of logos, basically. But then he said, well, logos has these two ways that it figures in a human life, right? Some aspects of our life are obedient to reason, or answerable to it, or persuadable by it, and some aspects of our life just are the exercise of it. Right? So that's what he's been talking about here. And so now he draws his conclusion. He says, so the fulfillment of human life is going to take two forms. It's going to take the form of fulfilling our definitive identity as logos beings in those aspects of our life that are not themselves logos but are open to it. And it will mean fulfilling our nature as logos type beings in those dimensions of our existence that are logos, that are the domain of taking account. And that then identifies two dimensions of human fulfillment, which he calls moral virtue, or another translation is excellence of character, and what he calls intellectual virtue, or another translation would be excellence of thought. Now, that excellence of thinking, intellectual virtue, that means the cultivation and development of your powers of taking account. And that's, pretty straightforward what that means. That's what you're doing when you're going to school, right? By going to school and studying, you learn how to think about things better. You learn about history, you learn about grammar, you learn about science and philosophy. It's not particularly puzzling. It's pretty transparent what cultivating the powers of thinking involved, the powers of taking account. And that is an important part of the fulfillment of a human life, learning how to understand the world around you and learning how to think better. So he talks about that a little bit in book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics, which we're not going to talk about. And then, of course, it comes up in other contexts where he talks about the nature of knowledge and so on. And that should be a familiar enough thing. But it's the other one, what he calls moral virtue, or the excellence of character, that I think is particularly profound and important, and it's what this book really quite powerfully studies. This idea that there's a part of you that can be persuaded by reason. I want to just talk a little bit more about that, just to get you thinking about what that means. It means that in the way you deal with your desires for pleasure or to avoid pain, or in the way you deal with matters of fear, or in the way you deal with matters of shame, in the ways you deal with matters of having or giving, things that you have feelings about, like desires about, appetites about, in the way you deal with those things, you can deal with them in a way that is reflective of a person who, intelligently and insightfully takes account of things, or you can deal with those things in a way that does not reflect the perspective of a person who insightfully and intelligently takes account of things. So your fear in and of itself isn't logos, but how you live out your fear, what things you're afraid of, and what fearful responses you have will be reflective of roughly what kind of thinker you are. That's the sort of core issue, and the real sense of that, I think, will become clearer and fuller as we talk more about them. So when we're talking about moral virtue, or excellence of character, we're talking about things like courage or generosity. These are ways that you have a character. That's what kind of person you are in your moral behavior. And those things are ways that you have developed a relationship to that issue of, greed, wanting to have it all to yourself. Generosity is a certain relationship to that same kind of issue. Courage is a relationship to how you deal with fear. So in the domain of fear, there is a virtue that is courage. In the domain of whatever that thing is, of hoarding or something like that, there is a virtue of generosity. And those things are ways of living out that issue in human life in a way that is, as he says, persuaded by or obedient to a perspective that is intelligent and insightful in its appraisal of things and its taking account of things. Anyway, so that was just that I'm just trying to conjure up for you the sense of what we're talking about there. But let's look now at Book 2, Chapter 1. So as I said, the intellectual virtues, the cultivation of your power of thinking as such, that comes through teaching and going to school. Right? So he says the intellectual virtue in the main owes both its birth and its growth to teaching. But moral virtue comes about as a result of habit. Right? And what does that mean? He says, it is from playing the lyre that both good and bad lyre players are produced. The corresponding statement is true of builders and all the rest. Men will be good or bad builders as a result of building well or badly, etc., etc. And this is the case of the virtues also. By doing the acts that we do in our transactions with other men, we become just or unjust. By doing the acts that we do in the presence of danger and being habituated to feel fear or confidence, we become brave or cowardly. This is true of appetites and feelings of anger. Some men become temperate and good-tempered, others self-indulgent and irascible, and they do that by behaving in one way or the other in the appropriate circumstances. Thus, in one word, states of character arise out of like activities. Right, so as he said, they come about by habituation. The way you become a courageous person is by having developed the habit of behaving confidently in dangerous situations. The way you become a good-tempered person is by having practiced that activity of handling your anger well. Just as you become a good guitar player by becoming habituated to playing the guitar well. But you also become an excessively angry or a cowardly person or a bad guitar player by habituation. If you spend your life practicing poor responses to those situations or poor techniques of playing the guitar, you'll be a crappy guitar player. You will be a crappy guitar player, and you will be an angry person or a cowardly person. So the states of character don't come by someone lecturing you. They come by what you practice. And you, through your habituation, you instill in yourself a behavioral character. And then I want to just give you the last thing he says here. So he says, it makes no small difference then whether we form habits of one kind or another from our very youth. It makes a very great difference, or rather all the difference. So what kind of person you're going to be with respect to these issues of moral character, that's going to have its roots in what you've practiced from youth. You can see how important the issues of upbringing are going to be. So now let's go on and look at moral virtue.